Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Marjorie Jean-Pierre, and I'm a Senior Director at the United States Energy Association. And we are so pleased that you are able to join us for our webinar series on mini-grid operations in rural communities, challenges and opportunities. This program is part of the Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, AmpUp, program, which is managed by the U.S. Energy Association and financed and coordinated by the U.S. Agency for International Development. For those new to the United States Energy Association, or USDA, our goal is to convene, educate, and provide a nonpartisan forum for the energy industry internationally. Overseas, USDA supports energy development by expanding access to safe, affordable, and sustainable energy in partnership with the U.S. government. We have been able for over 40 years to have a wonderful relationship and to collaborate with the U.S. Agency for International Development to provide capacity building assistance to our overseas partners for increased energy security and access by developing and conducting capacity building programs that encourage the sharing of global best practices and exposure to the latest developments, including private sector engagement, market-based approaches to utility operations, management, implementation of regulations, and environmental safeguards. The U.S. Energy Association, in collaboration with a consortium of highly skilled organizations, will be managing an initiative with USAID called the Advancing Modern Power Utility Partnerships AmpUp program. The consortium is comprised of Arizona State University, MK Advisors, NRECA International, Segura Consulting. AmpUp was developed to introduce an innovative performance improvement model centered around peer-to-peer relationships and strong practitioner and stakeholder networks. This webinar is being led by NRECA International and is presented under the AmpUp Technology Webinar Series. The series will highlight current energy issues being discussed and implemented globally and will be led by each AmpUp consortium member. This webinar is the first in a series of 3, and we hope you will continue to join us for the others. Mini-grids have continued to be seen as a feasible means to increasing electricity access in rural areas. We are very pleased to have an expert list of panelists who will address the challenges and opportunities for mini-grid operations during the webinar today. Again, thank you for attending, and I now have the pleasure of introducing from USAID, Kristen Madler, Clean Energy Coordinator, Energy Division, Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure from the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security, REFs, from U.S. Agency for International Development. Kristen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. As Marjorie mentioned, this webinar is brought to you by the AmpUp program, and each of the AmpUp consortium members have access to a very robust network with vast experiences in supporting the global energy transition that is working to solve shared energy sector challenges in cooperation with international counterparts. In today's session, we look forward to learning from the experiences of NRECA in operating mini-grids in communities around the world. And ongoing debates on how to provide electricity to the roughly 1 billion people in developing countries without access to power have identified mini-grids as a promising way forward. Mini-grids can help countries reach their overall development goals, energy sector objectives, and national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. However, despite their tremendous potential, uptake of mini-grids is slow, investment risks remain high, and a variety of business models exist globally. So speakers throughout this series will share their experiences working within various mini-grid markets. Participants will discuss innovative business models for developing, financing, owning, operating, and managing mini-grids, as well as policy actions that can address business barriers in licensing, tariff setting, and connection costs. I would like to thank NRECA for organizing today's webinar, and also thank each of our speakers for carving out time to share their experiences and expertise today. So please stay tuned, as Marjorie mentioned, for more technical webinars from the AmpUp program in the coming months, and I'll pass the floor to Marjorie to continue with today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Kristen, not always for participating, but the continued support of USAID as well. So I'm now pleased to hand over the management of this webinar to the capable hands of Zoraida Hoffman of NRECA International. Zoraida.
Thank you, Marjorie. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Kristen. My name is Zoraida Hoffman, and I will be the moderator for today. And I'm joining you from Arlington, Virginia. And on behalf of NRECA International, welcome to our discussion today titled Keeping the Lights On. As Marjorie said, it's the first of the three-part webinar series on the challenges and opportunities in operating mini-grids in rural communities. Before we start, a few housekeeping items and reminders. There'll be an opportunity to ask our panelists questions in the last 15 to 20 minutes or so of our discussion. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, but the Q&A section. I'll be working with my colleague Tricia Williams from USCA today, who is with me behind the scenes, and will do her very best to respond to as many questions as possible. But don't worry, this webinar will also be recorded or is being recorded and will be available through the USCA YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So let's begin. As Marjorie and Kristen have already said, mini-grids are becoming more accessible to bring power to rural communities in developing countries like those in Sub-Saharan Africa, where, as we know, 600 million people still live without access to electricity. However, as all our panelists today know firsthand, challenges to operate mini-grids can vary from country to country and even by region. To create an environment that is sustainable, reliable, and affordable for mini-grid operators and the consumers at the end of the line. We're very fortunate to have our group of panelists today who have deep experience in the field of mini-grids, but who also can offer very different perspectives and knowledge in this area. So today with us are Tombo Banda. Tombo, raise your hand. Managing Director of Cross Boundary. Tombo leads their mini-grid innovation lab, which supports the energy sector transition to the power grid of the future. Tombo today joins us from Nairobi. Welcome. Next, we have John Kadenda, Chief of Utility Operations at PowerGen Renewable Energy, a private power company that builds and manages power infrastructure to deliver clean, reliable, and affordable electricity to customers across many countries in Africa. Today, John joins us from Detroit, Michigan. We also have Arship Lobo. Arship, if you could turn your camera on for just a moment. He is the co-founder of Nuru, a company dedicated to increasing power access for the people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A few years ago, Nuru deployed the country's first solar-based mini-grid in the city of Goma, which is also the largest mini-grid in Sub-Saharan Africa. He joins us from the eastern part of the DRC. And we're keeping his camera off just to make sure that the bandwidth and he can actually hear us, and also we can hear him when he has to speak later on. And last but not least, we have my colleague, Frank Burke, who is the Senior Electric Engineer for NRECA International, a nonprofit organization based in the US. NRECA International was established more than 60 years ago with a mission to bring power to communities around the world using lessons learned from the US electric co-op movement that today serves about 42 million consumer members. And Frank joins us from Cincinnati, Ohio. So as you can see, we have a pretty impressive group. So we'll start today with our panelists introducing themselves for a few minutes to help us sort of set the stage for our discussion. And I'd like to start with you, Tombo. If you could introduce yourself, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Zoraida. Hi, everyone. My name is Tombo Banda. I lead the Mini-Grid Innovation Lab at Cross Boundary. And as Zoraida mentioned, we are supporting the sector transition to the power grid of the future. And how are we doing that, and what has it got to do with mini-grids? So our primary mandate is to make the mini-grid business model more profitable. As Kristen mentioned, there is limited investment in mini-grids, though it is recognized as, one of the electrification methods for the many unelectrified people across Sub-Saharan Africa and the wider world. So we make the mini-grid business model more profitable, or discover what makes it more profitable, by working with developers such as PowerGen to test innovations that either reduce cost or increase revenues. And we share these findings with the sector with the ultimate objective of getting more private sector investment into mini-grids and ensuring that mini grids play their part in the larger electrification mix for countries across the continent. So that's really what I do. Engineer by training and working on the business model side really over the past 3 years, specifically for mini grids, and very excited to share more about what we've learned with you all. Thanks.
Thank you, Tombo. Next, I'd like to invite John Kadenda. John, if you could say a few words.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Kadenda. I'm the Chief of Utility Operations at PowerGen. PowerGen is a mini-grid developer / distributed renewable energy operator across multiple African countries. We serve a little under 40,000 customers or about 200,000 individuals with power through our mini-grids, which are primarily solar hybrid mini-grids. We have operations in Kenya, in Sierra Leone, in Nigeria, in DRC, and really glad to be here and to share what my thoughts on the sector.
Thank you, John. And next, I'd like to invite Arship on. I don't seem to see him. I bet you he'll sign back on again. Let's move to you, Frank, if we could. And then we'll bring Arship back in when he joins back. Oh, here he is. Let's see. Arship, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Actually, very sorry. We had an internet issue. And
No
I've
problem.
moved from I moved from my computer to my phone.
That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Whatever works.
Yeah.
So I was just introducing you. If you could tell our audience a little bit about you for a few minutes before we start our discussion.
Okay, great. Maybe I'll turn on my camera.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. First of all, allow me first to express my gratitude to NRCA that invited me as one of the webinar panelists about the mini-grid operation in rural communities, looking at the challenges and opportunities and how we all think on how to keep the lights on. Again, my name is Arship Lobo Ngumba. I'm a Nuru's co-founder and managing director. I also lead the business development at Nuru. For those who don't know, Nuru is a mini-grid developer in the Democratic Republic of Congo that aims to accelerate energy access by providing the world-class connectivity to more than 5 million delighted clients by 2024. Currently, we have a free operating site in DRC with an installed capacity of 1.67 megawatts that serves more than 3,000 customers, and we are currently deploying and expanding our operations by adding 13.7 megawatts in 3 major cities of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we are developing a 35 megawatts pipeline for us to be able to serve additional 50,000 clients. I'll stop it by there for now, but I look forward to provide Nuru's perspective on challenges and opportunities to operate mini-grid in DRC market.
Thank you, Arship. Yeah, I think your perspective will play very well with the discussion that we have today. And Frank, on to you. Introduce yourself.
Thanks, Zoraida. And I'm really excited to be part of the discussion today with these panelists. NRECA International is a nonprofit organization with over 60 years of experience in rural electrification globally. Our power systems have given power to 160 million people globally in over 45 countries, with over 250 small utilities formed with the assistance of NRECA International, which it's good, we had about a 50-year head start on the mini grid industry. So the mini grid sector, as we know it today, has really advanced in the last decade with the cost reductions and advancements in solar energy, battery storage, things like that. But my role within NRECA International is to make our long-term experience and expertise relevant and instrumental in growing the mini grid sector. So I had the privilege, even before joining NRECA, of being an independent consultant to several mini grid companies, including our colleagues both at PowerGen and Nuru. And those partnerships have continued with NRECA now serving as consultants to both mini grid companies, and then also advising donors, funders, and national governments on mini grid policy, deployment, and operations. So I'm happy to be part of the panel today. Thank you.
And I'm very happy to be moderating this panel today. It's always good to be with this kind of people who have different backgrounds and expertise. It's going to be a good discussion. So let's get into it. Before I ask the panelists questions, I'm going to ask the audience a question. Right now, as I can see, we have almost 100 attendees, which is fantastic. I'd like to ask all of you a question, and if you could put your response in the chat box. And, as we go on, and, perhaps that will also inspire some responses from our panelists as well. And it'll be good for them and for us all actually to learn to see why you're here. So the question is, what do you want to learn from the session today? What do you want to learn from the session today? So if you can just put it in the chat box, your response, and as we go on, I'll keep an eye on it, and our panelists can also see the chat box, and we'll move from there. So as you do that, I'm going to ask, let's start this conversation. So Tombo, I'm going to start with you. We've seen, and you said a little bit about this at the beginning, we've seen very interesting things, interesting research coming from Cross Boundaries Mini Grid Innovation Lab, which you know very well, obviously, regarding mini grid operations. So what insights can you share today about why mini grids have become the power solution of choice?
Yeah, so Zoraida, as of today, mini grids are the least cost electrification technology for at least 260 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa alone. And this is due to, as Frank was mentioning, many advances in reduction in cost of solar, cost of batteries, cost of deployment. They are least cost for these communities because they are cheaper and faster than extending the grids to some of these communities, which can be, far from urban centers, far from where the grid now is in many of these countries. So where we see mini grids growing in proliferation is where they are least cost for those communities. And because they are least cost, we have developers such as PowerGen, such as Nuru, and others who are recognizing the business opportunity there, and also the development opportunity for those communities. And what we see when mini grids come to communities is, they create jobs through their construction, during their construction, through ongoing maintenance, and they also create economic opportunities for those communities. So, productive use machinery becomes available to these communities that were previously only using diesel alternatives or manual methods. Healthcare centers, education centers are electrified. So, with these benefits, we have entrepreneurs, businesses that are going into these communities and starting to put up mini grids. We have development partners and governments that are recognizing that this is the right technology and the most cost-effective technology for electrifying and providing energy access to these communities. So we see, mini grid development and deployment increase, but yet the rate of deployment is still not fast enough for what we want to see. At current rates of deployment, we're not going to meet SDG 7, so we're not going to have universal access by 2030, right? We need to massively the rate of deployment of mini grids, and you need additional investment in mini grids to see that happen. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I think everybody's got nodding their head and agreeing, and I'll say it firsthand. I mean, it makes sense, but it's not moving fast enough. And with the climate summit in New York a couple of weeks ago, this was a huge topic of discussion, not just for SDG 7, but for all the SDGs, right? So we have to hurry up, basically. So I'll move on to you, John. From your perspective, I mean, PowerGen's been an established mini-grid developer in Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, and you've been in the business for a long time. Tombo talked about, you know, how it makes sense, and this is the way to go. And I think we all agree. So what have you seen as some of the roadblocks to keeping the lights on using the mini-grid solution?
Thanks, Zoraida. I think I'll just zero in on two that are
Yes.
particularly top of mind for me. One is enabling policy, but I think for me, more importantly, policy consistency. We've seen a steady increase in countries that have, you know, mini-grid and other distributed energy solutions as an explicit part of their national electrification plans, and that are creating frameworks to make it possible for private sector participation to be a part of the solution for their electrification goals. We need more of that. We need better policies in place that are actually implementable and that take into account the administrative capacity of the various countries in which we operate in, which varies dramatically from country to country, and oftentimes is quite low. And then policy consistency. I often say that the only thing worse than bad policy is inconsistent policy. Because what happens is you take 2 steps forwards, 3 steps back, and nobody ever returns to an environment where they invested. You know, we're in the business of deploying significant amounts of capital. We are a very capital-intensive business. So if we come into a market and put steel in the ground with a 25-year investment horizon, and then because we saw really good policy in place, and then 4 years later it changes, not only do the people who we were serving with reliable and affordable electricity go from not having electricity to having electricity to not having electricity again, which is quite tragic. But you know, once bitten, twice shy, right? And so you set the country back significantly by not thinking about, in addition to whether this is a good policy framework, is this something that is supportable over the life of the types of projects that we're thinking about? And if not, it's better not even to have that policy in place, as far as I'm concerned, because it's just not going to work, and you're going to cause a deployment of resources that it's not going to serve the people in that community, and will, you know, by definition, not be able to serve another community. And then the second thing I would say is tied into the current, you know, has become more acute in the current macroeconomic environment, which is FX rates, FX hedging, and the ability to have affordable and tailor-made solutions to help operators like us who generate our revenues in local currency, but often finance in hard currency, give us tools to be able to bridge that divide, whether that's, you know, larger, more robust local currency debt solutions that enable us to match the currency of financing with the currency of revenue, or which is standalone FX hedging tools, or parties that are willing to take some sort of first loss on forex depreciation, so that we have some sort of more predictability around what our revenues will be in hard currency in 5-10 years. So those are, I think, two that for me are quite key.
I think we could have a session or webinar on just those two topics alone to really dive deep. But we can't do that today. But I'm thinking of 100 different questions now for you, John. But this is sort of a nice lead-in, Arship, to you, being your background and what you do, talking about the challenges in working in what we hope would be an enabling environment within a country or with the government. So, I mean, NURU is operating the largest mini grid in Central Africa. So if you could share, and you talked a little bit about this in the beginning, the operational challenges that you face with such a large urban power system, because it's not rural, the density in Goma is pretty huge. So what can you share with us?
Yes, thanks. Actually, as a mini grid developer in the urban area, what we want to make sure every day is like we keep the 100% of uptime and power availability to our end consumers. And that goes from our ability to be able to monitor the generation outputs, and also making sure that the distribution network are well maintained, in addition to our ability also to assure that the uptime power available at the meter level for our end consumers. But also we want to make sure that we can be able to not allow our customers to be able to pay for their energy access real time, and for the company to be able to collect also revenue in order to hit our commercial targets. So few challenges we have been experiencing for us to be able to provide delighted services to our end consumers and to keep the lights on is, first of all, the issue to access premium technologies that will allow us only not be able to track the generation output, and in case there is an emergent and urgent maintenance to be done on a panel, on an inverter, or a battery storage, we should be able to look at that real time. But technology issues becoming more challenging because we have experienced few times where we had shut down at one of our sites we're operating in Goma, and we couldn't be able to resolve the issue right away. That time, not only our clients are complaining to not have energy access, but also it's a revenue loss for the company. The other issue is, even if we do have access to some of the technology, like SCADA and others at the generation level, and we do also have smart meters for us to be able to integrate mobile money payments to collect revenues real time, and also track the power consumption by clients. They all use internet. So internet access to some of the cities in DRC is challenging. I think you have experienced the fact that I was almost off for about 30 seconds before joining this webinar, but that these are some of the issues actually we experience, which is not only first of all a revenue loss and risk on investment, but also it doesn't allow us to provide a delighted clients, and customer satisfaction rates goes down. So that's one aspect of it. But when you have a shutdown or shutdown, or a client don't have energy access, there are customer complaints management that becomes an issue. And again, technology to be able for us to track the customer complaints real time, still an issue. But also, especially as we also have experience in the rural area, one of the challenges we experience in the rural area is really how do we optimize generations due to the lack of demand in some of those rural areas. And I think that's where productive use of electricity tools becomes more important in order to stimulate demand in those markets for de-risking investment, but also keep accelerating energy access in rural area. And lastly, I'll speak more on the development growth management and affordability issues, especially in the GRC. For supply chain and logistics is an issue, because we depends on international supply chain for both panels, base and batch and inverters as well. That's not only becomes difficult after with the Ukraine war and after the COVID outbreak. Not only becomes difficult for us to access some of those equipment, but also increases costs on the project's cost and to the end consumers, and that has significant impacts on energy access accelerations in the DRC market. I'll keep it there for now and follow up.
Thank you.
With questions.
Thank you, Arshad. And I have to say that, and I'm going to ask Frank next. And I know since we work together that all of this is very familiar to you, Frank. Everything that everybody's saying is sort of singing the same from the same sheet of music that I know you play from. So, in working with you, I know that you played a key role in NRECA International's off-grid planning, electrification planning activities. So what can you say after listening to all this? What trends have you seen in this space over the last 5 years or so, and how are they different from today? Because we're, at NRECA International, we work with, everybody with the different roles that they play in this room. So what can you tell us?
Yeah, it's great that the other panelists have made so many of the key points. It's a luxury to be able to follow them. I have less to say. The NRECA has been involved in a lot of geospatial electrification planning. We're an instrumental partner with many African governments in developing these energy access plans that increasingly favor mini grids and view mini grids as playing a larger role in electrification. We've been involved in electrification planning in about a dozen African countries now, and it's been really interesting to see the trends and see the different geographies, the different population densities, the different countries where mini grids may be favored relative to others. And in the process, we've designed, we're getting close to 10,000 mini grids we've designed geospatially as part of these electrification planning efforts. I would definitely say there's more room for mini grid developers and proponents to be at the table in those electrification planning exercises. We have stakeholder engagement processes on all of them. They're not always well represented by mini grid developers, and that's simply because mini grid developers have a lot else on their plate. And so being part of these national strategies is really an important way to bring that to the fore. But I would say that mini grids over the past few years, they continue to evolve in their complexity and in their ability to reach remote areas. I think a lot of financing that's been made available to mini grids lately is focused on the most financially viable sites within a country. So, by design, if we're attracting private sector finance, that finance is going to come to where profit is achievable. And to be honest, there's a tension between universal access by 2030 to meet SDG 7 and having financially viable projects for the specific type of finance that's being offered in these projects. Not to say that there's no business model that would be financially viable in a remote community, but when the finance comes, with certain terms and conditions and the different, currency in which it's being offered and the different, return expectations and layering on, in some cases, corporate equity versus project debt versus corporate debt versus grant financing and subsidies, it can be very confusing. And it also can be a bit limiting in terms of which communities are going to be served with the present model And also the model varies from country to country, from funder to funder. In some cases, we have, one country where NRECA has written the national electrification analysis and developed a national electrification strategy, but we find multiple funders active in that country who either haven't read it or aren't aware of it. And all too often, the governments or the ministries of energy maybe have varying levels of compliance. Maybe they're not maintaining the geospatial data sets that were developed. And that's a common issue, because we always are involved in capacity building. That capacity building may not always survive, change of government or the next election cycle or whatever else. So I do think there's a role for continued engagement between the public sector and private sector in tailoring the level of funds and the prioritization of funding for mini grids, as well as making sure that the mini grid developers can thrive with the areas that are earmarked or targeted for mini grid investment. One example would be, for projects that are supported with results-based financing, maybe the results-based financing could be higher in areas where the mini grid developer is developing a project that's part of the national electrification strategy. Otherwise, if it's a wide open map, developers may choose areas that are right at the edge of the national power grid or high population density, but would otherwise be served by the national grid in the next few years. You can find maybe you could find an area that's peri-urban right at the edge of the grid that'd be very profitable to operate a mini grid, but not in the best interest of the country, because the country is preparing to electrify that community anyways, and there's no added electrification benefit. So changing the rules of results-based financing to really favor the communities that are optimal for mini grid development, or also finding other ways to incentivize this electrification outcome versus the tension with the financial viability, financial viability won't reach universal electrification. I think that needs to be clearly said, that mini grid electrification as currently practiced is a good way to get from maybe 12-15% rural electrification up to 30-50% rural electrification, but many communities in these national plans are not going to be met with 15% rate of return on a mini grid investment. So I think it's a diversity of factors.
So it sounds like, well, a number of things, as you've said many things, but it sounds like, based on what all of you are saying, is that there needs to be continued conversation and awareness building, because at the end of the day, it's, the consumers at the end of the line, right, who we are trying to help to get power. And those of us here in the room are involved in a lot of the relationship building and awareness building at the top to make sure, to what John was saying also with you, Frank, sounds like you were sort of going along the same lines, which I think is very important. And I just wanted to say real quick, for those of you who just joined us or have joined in late, the chat, and if my panelists want to take a look, feel free. There's a lot of activity on the chat, but I wanted to just remind people that there will be a Q&A section at the end, toward the end of our discussion here today, for maybe 15-20 minutes. And if you do have a question, please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. I see some questions coming in on the chat. It would be better if you put it in the Q&A section. It'll be easier for us to keep track of what needs to be answered. So from there, I'm going to move back to you, John, because Arship mentioned this, and I'm glad he did, because with the work that Nuru does, the challenges that he mentioned were technology related, really, and that's sort of one of them, not all of them, obviously. And you mentioned, and just from what I know from your background, in integrating platforms, that's what you have a lot of experience in, and it certainly increases the efficiency of the operational side, keeping track of not just customer complaints, but trying to figure out load, demand, outages, and so on. So I want to talk about technology for a few minutes. I mean, not everybody can get all the best types of software or technology out there, but what are some of the most essential tools in terms of technology integration that you think are most critical?
Yeah, sure. I think for us, remote monitoring technology is not a nice to have. It's a must have. It's fundamental to being able to achieve our goals within a cost envelope that results in tariffs that that are sustainable in the long run. And that's really driven by the fact that we are, by definition, building distributed systems, and the distances between these grids that we build can be, multiple days of travel, for instance. And so if you have a system that relies on human beings moving between these sites, and you very quickly end up in a situation where any type of system downtime or issue at a particular site can very easily wipe out all your margin for an entire month for a single trip. And if you do that, then you're just never going to get into a place where you're building a financially viable project. So technology then comes in to enable us to do as much as possible remotely from wherever the headquarters is, wherever the regional hub for that country is, whatever structure you have in place. The more you can do without having to actually send a human being to the site, the better your financial situation is going to be. And we think about technology in sort of two large buckets. There's what I call power system monitoring technology, and then the metering technology. And both of them are essential in my view. So the power system monitoring technology tells you how your generation asset is doing, how your batteries, the health of your batteries. The most expensive components of your system are going to be your batteries and inverters. So you don't want a situation where those get damaged for preventable reasons. So the faster you can figure out if something's off in those systems, the better. And so there's tools to be used for that. And then all our grids, I didn't mention this before, all our grids are smart grids. So they have smart inverters that we can pull data from remotely. Maybe each household that we serve as a smart meter, which enables not only easier customer interaction for payments and the like, but also importantly helps us to remotely monitor power consumption and ensure, one, that the customers actually has access to power, build tools to try and remotely detect power theft, for instance, and other types of meter tampering that not only presents presents us with potential financial losses, but are a key source of risk around health and safety. And so we have tools that we use. A lot of them are provided by the manufacturers of these products. So both on the metering side and on the inverter side. And then we in-house have a software development team that we use to sort of build tools that I think of as more connective tissue, right? That can make the inverter system be able to speak to the metering system and connects the local mobile network operator to the metering system so that we can do payments, and enables us to pool all our data across all these systems into one place so that we can do analysis that is meaningful to us. So so those are three sort of buckets: the power system, the metering, and then the bits in between that we build to sort of stitch these things together.
Thank you. That is a very visual description you gave, which is great, and I can almost see it. So Tombo, you've heard what everybody else has been saying, and it sounds like people in this room have the answers, or at least the questions also, actually, right, that we have to ask ourselves and ask the environments that we want to work in, but that the brains are here, obviously. So in hearing all that, I am thinking about how you've been very vocal over years now about how the mini grid model is the way to bring power to rural Sub-Saharan Africa. And I have found that very interesting. So in hearing all this, what else can you say about what does it take, in addition to what we've heard, to make this model not just successful, we get funding to make it operate, but to keep it sustainable, to keep it running for years and years. So what do you think it would take?
Yeah, so Zoraida, I'll try to tie together quite a lot of the things that Frank, Archip, and John has said. I think they have pretty much covered it all, but if I was to tie it all together, I would say the sector is aiming towards a levelized cost of electricity that is low, around 20 cents or thereabouts, depending on who you ask. And that kind of cost of electricity will enable developers to charge the end users tariffs that are deemed more affordable or closer to what they see as grid tariffs. And the path to getting to that lower levelized cost of electricity, I think, is beginning to be clearer and clearer due to all of these innovations that we're testing along the cost side, along the revenue side. And I think generally what it's tending towards is, smaller modular systems tied to productive use. And within that, there's lots of, different innovations, lots of different tweaks that you'd make according to your own local context. And I'm sure AmpUp and John will, attest to that across the many different geographies that they work and the different, innovations that they apply depending on the context and the communities, to further increase, profitability and viability. At present, at the Innovation Lab, we think, your standard business model for mini grids, the return on the investment somewhere between 5 and 6% based on what we see across, many sites across different countries. Frank mentioned that, we would want it to be like 15. And I think that's quite a long way off, but, potentially it's achievable. We think, if it gets somewhere between 12%, that will mean, investors are willing to put more money into it as it's comparable to other infrastructure investments that you would otherwise invest in. But, as Frank said, and as AmpUp and John will probably attest to, it really depends on the site and really depends on the community, what kind of returns you're going to get. And as the more desirable sites, the sites with higher demand, the sites with anchor loads reduce and you get more and more remote communities, I think, the case for de-risking mechanisms, guarantees for forex risk, to ensure that, developers can, meet their financial obligations, increases. So the role of, subsidies, the role of RBF needs to remain a part of the conversation and needs to be acknowledged. And I think, electrification across the globe has always involved subsidies. And, for the poorest communities across Sub-Saharan Africa and the globe, that will also remain to be the case. So I think, in summary, smaller modular systems coupled with productive use, de-risking mechanisms, guarantees, subsidies or other forms is part of that formula to making, mini grids roll out at scale.
So what I've heard, and I'm also keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A, productive use has come up quite a bit, and which I'm going to get into in a minute. And of course, funding is always a big topic, and not just funding, one-time funding, but sustained funding and support. I find that to be the most interesting and probably the most challenging parts. And AmpUp, I'm going to turn back to you for a minute. We talked earlier about the challenges that you have with your team at Nuru. And I really like that you brought up the technology part of it, because and basic internet access that a lot of us take for granted. And John sort of matched your, sort of filled in the blanks there for those of us who are interested to know what is the most important types of technology that you could use to make things basically run better. But I'd like to ask you, and I don't think we covered this too much. Most of I know Tombo and John and Frank work. I think you do too. In more rural communities versus the urban. And when we met last week, we talked about how, if we could discuss about the differences, or if they are, maybe there aren't, different challenges that, mini grids in rural areas versus mini grid in urban areas. Because as Tombo said, one mini grid is just one mini grid. It could be very different from place to place, depending on the communities. But in your experience, what are the different challenges that you've seen or faced between rural and urban mini grids, if any?
Yeah. Thanks again. Probably I'll start with the common challenges for both, in addition to the technology issues that I articulated before. I would rather say that human capacity and skill set in both urban and rural areas are key issues to consider, looking at the design side, but also the operation maintenance side, in addition to the finance capacity to be able to not only develop competitive business model, but also make sure that we stay within our cost and meet our financial obligations as we develop mini grids and operate them in the market of DRC. So the difference will be probably in pure rural areas. You might lack capacities to the people who are going to operate the site, and requires now really more capacity buildings and outsourcing capacity to be able to operate the sites, which sometimes are way expensive and adds operations costs to become higher, and doesn't allow sometimes, especially in rural areas, to stay within our revenue projections, and the OPEX cost goes a bit crazy and high. And that's one aspect of it. And the second thing we also face as a challenge is the affordability to access electricity, with not only to pay connection fees, but in addition to for the end consumers to pay the tariff that will allow the mini grid developer to be economically viable. So the way we sometimes try to navigate the issues is, again, relying on competitive equity and investment, and also competitive debt in global markets, but also I think not only RBF connection subsidies and capex subsidies becomes critical in order to ensure affordability and accelerate energy access in purely rural areas. And as I said, also most of the rural areas here, people use probably electricity just for charging phones, watching TVs, and there's no real consumptions, especially coming from businesses. So I think it's also not only how do we have to unlock opportunities in those rural areas to create demands, but also more productive use approach and instruments, rather in providing entrepreneurship in initiative in agro processing sector, things like that, allows then the rural areas to use electricity as a transformative tool, a source of additional revenue for them, which also helps optimizing the generation from the developer, and helps to de-risk investment in pure rural areas. But the other challenge, focusing on the rural area, on urban area, is demand grows fast. From the time probably you did the first demand assessment, and in a period of 1 year and a half, probably the generation that was deployed will be saturated. How do you manage growth quick enough to be able to respond to the new demand growth? That requires actually not only to already anticipate on your growth pipeline and strategies, and from the time you close financing, you run construction, and you're on operation phase. How do you anticipate to start accessing a new demand growth, and developing that new pipeline and raise investment for that? So there's still gonna be an issue between demands you're trying to supply and the growth that comes with it, because in the city, once the power is available, people in the household will buy refrigerators, they'll iron using electricity, businesses will grow their capacities fast enough. So those are some of the challenges we face. In rural areas, there are good problems to deal with, because it means the more demand you have, great for investors you work with, and helps also the mini grid developer to grow faster. And that's one thing we have been experiencing so far.
So it's like a cycle, yeah? I mean, you bring power, and NRECA International, we say that it starts with power. That's just the beginning, it's not the end. And that's when we have to, and Frank, I'm gonna let you talk about, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about this in terms of, we go in and you bring electricity through the mini-grid model or the co-op model, or whichever way. And, we've seen, I think, how, and I'd like for you to address this a little bit, Frank, and how you've seen this sort of part of it evolve over the last few years, in that there's a lot of productive use programs. I know NRECA International has been involved in it, but what have you seen in this area with productive use, and also as how it's been part of the electrification planning that you've been involved in, and if that's sort of evolved?
Sure. So productive use of electricity is a fascinating topic, right? It's basically a fancy word for rural economic development. If people are, what we call productive is using electricity for income, outside of household tasks, and that's a good proxy for starting businesses or creating new economic activity in rural areas, which to be honest is quite stagnant in the absence of electricity. Certainly there's progress that can be made agriculturally or in certain aspects of economic life, but having access to electricity allows for post-processing of agricultural products, and it allows for a lot of labor reducing strategies. It also enables less time for gathering of water supplies, firewood, etc., which really has a positive youth positive and gender positive impact on the community as well. But in terms of building mini grids around the concept of productive use of energy is a pretty sensitive topic in some communities. It implies a lifestyle transition that may or may not be well understood or well chosen by the community. So I think community engagement is vital. Working closely with community members to ensure that funds are available in a way that makes that productive use of electricity broadly inclusive, and helps everyone to have access to it. One of the programs we have in Liberia is we have a productive use loan fund, a revolving loan fund. The Total Electric Cooperative is a mini grid that's operated as an electric cooperative. So the only owners of this infrastructure are people who receive electricity from it. There's no foreign investor. There's no funder or donor who has a seat on the board of this co-op. It's all members, and that co-op has created a revolving loan fund in which people, for example, somebody has a cold storage business where they're helping to keep agricultural produce cool, so that it can be resold or transported to other areas. So freezing meat products or other products that can be then sold. And that revolving loan fund has been highly successful. It allows for the community to kind of peer-to-peer fund each other's productive use businesses, much like a credit union or a community lending circle. And that same model, I think, is broadly applicable, but the funds for the productive use thus far have been largely decoupled from the funding for the infrastructure itself. So you have this chicken or egg situation where you have infrastructure without productive use, or productive use for people who are buying diesel gensets to supply their own electricity needs for rural businesses. And a lot of the burden, unfortunately, for that access to productive use has been placed on the mini grid developers themselves. So people like PowerGen, Nuru, and others are also financing productive use products like refrigerators or appliances for their customers to help improve their business model, which is quite difficult. I would just say it's difficult because now you're creating this company that's already doing a very challenging business model, which is operating rural mini grids, and then also asking them to be fiduciary responsible for these kind of sub loans. So defaults on the productive use program can hurt the mini grid itself. I think there's a real challenge in the industry for producing those outcomes we want and incentivizing them in a way that doesn't limit the effectiveness or burden the mini grid developer. It allows the mini grid developer to be good at the electricity business and allows the customers to get the access to it's really end user finance, not project finance when it comes to productive uses.
I'd like to, we have half an hour to go. So I'm going to ask one more question to the group, and then I'm going to go into the Q&A section. And I invite my panelists to just sort of browse if you have the wherewithal. But I'd like to ask, we've been talking a lot about what needs to be done and the challenges, right? We all know what they are, or what all of you think of this. I'd like for you to now, maybe we can pivot a little bit, and I'll let each one of you decide, who can go first. But I'd like for you to share with the audience of what you've learned over the last 5-6 years, or in your experience, what you've learned over the last few years that you can share that with people in the audience who are either entering the business or have been in the business, so they don't have to go through the same growing pains that you did when you started. And just to give them a sense of, okay, I wish I'd done this, or maybe the trends or the technologies have changed so much that, okay, don't do this, do that. What do you think? Who'd like to go? Or I can call you out. Tombo, would you like to give a go at this? And then I'll go down the line with whom I see on my screen, really.
Sure, I can go first, and I guess the advantage of this is I will say the new thing, but whatever I say, I think is going to be different from Frank, John, and Archie because of my perspective. So, from the perspective of the Mini Grid Innovation Lab, what I would give it in terms of advice to others entering the space, energy access space, especially if they're developers or looking to get into electrification, would be certainly to join organizations such as like the Africa Mini Grid Developers Association, join the Mini Grid Lab, where a lot of the learnings, a lot of the sector insights have been documented and collated. So you really don't have to, make the same mistakes that, the first pioneers of mini grids were making initially and have moved on from now. So that's just a tactical piece of advice. And I think, in terms of how I've seen the sector change from maybe a personal, professional perspective in terms of, what is right in energy access versus what is wrong, I would say there is nothing written in stone. So I think when I first joined the energy access sector, it was a lot about cost-reflective tariffs. Everything is cost-reflective tariffs. But, as time has gone on, there's been a realization that, communities can't afford cost-reflective tariffs necessarily. So how can you make developers whole without implementing a cost-reflective tariff on the end user, for example? Subsidies is a use of, as a solution for that. There's other solutions for that as well. So I think there should also be recognition that nothing is written in stone. We're still figuring out what works. And the situation is fluid, but it requires governments, development partners, financiers, developers as well, R&D institutions like us to be pliable and learn as we go, and not really stick to things that we think are written in stone. So that would be my advice.
So basically, learn from others. A lot of information is already out there.
Yeah.
Access that information and be flexible is what you're saying, I think, which is great.
Exactly.
All right, who wants to go next? John, would you like to give it a go?
Sure. I'd say being in multiple countries is very expensive. So if you have a choice, go deep in one geography and really build out there before going to another geography. And sometimes, when you're building this kind of stuff, there are a lot of external drivers that determine your strategy. So in the early days, really, you had to go where the programs were that were supporting this sector. As the programs increase in number, you can afford to be a little more strategic and narrow in terms of the markets that you want to focus in on, because every new market that you open up is going to have to support the group infrastructure in addition to its own P&L. And then, yeah, look out. I mentioned, good versus bad policy, consistent versus inconsistent policy. I'll add one, which is in policy enforcement. There's a lot of nice things written on paper. Make sure that on the ground, the regulator and the relevant ministry and the national administration is both able and willing to enforce what is written in the regulation. That is something that should be top of mind for you when thinking about where to play in this business.
In my own personal opinion, I think that's one of the most challenging parts of all the work that we do. Arship, what about you? What can you share with others so they won't repeat some of the either mistakes or challenges that you went through when you first got into the business?
Yeah, I'll definitely say that as you want to enter the sector, the most important thing to make sure is well done is the regulatory compliance, because you want to make sure that you have appropriate permits and authorizations to operate in energy sector under the law of the geography where you want to operate, and making sure the communication with the regulator and appropriate competent authorities good enough. The second one will be also just on demand assessment. I know there are technologies that exist to do quick demand assessment, which can be using the remote demand assessment. Conducting a deep ground and field demand assessment using appropriate tools for big OCA clients and household and SMEs is important, because what you don't want to do is to be in the situation that you have overproduced power in the area where there's less demand. And as Frank said, this puts you in the situation where now you have to create demands rather than focusing on the core business, which is to sell electricity and provide any energy access and collect revenues. You'll be now dealing with new complexity on how do you stimulate and stimulate demand on those markets, which is not a core business, your core business. And I'll say finally, also is how make sure that you have enough human capacity to be able to manage both the growth side and the operation side, because you don't want your staff to be overwhelmed in the way they cannot deliver on both sides, and becomes a huge risk not only to deliver on operating obligations, but also makes your growth becomes literally either slow or impossible.
Thank you. We haven't really gone down too deep about the capacity building with staff and teams within these operations, which I hope we'll have time to get into a bit. Frank, I'll let you take the last one on this question, and then I might have to pivot back to you for the first question. I'm going through the Q&A list right now. But what can you share? What have you learned that you can share so others don't do some of the things you wish you didn't do?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to go through 4 items, and I'll do them quickly. First is to be specific. There's mini grids. When we write a national electrification plan, there are mini grids in that plan that are 100 customers and I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars. And there's mini grids in that plan quite often that are 10,000 consumers with, I don't know, $10 million budget, something like that. And it's all called a mini grid. But the financing mechanisms, the technical level of staff per consumer expectations, the customer service expectations are quite different across the whole kaleidoscope of what we're calling mini grids these days. Some might be partially on the grid, partially off the grid at the grid edge, like I mentioned earlier. Some might be incredibly remote and might have, a mesh grid or some kind of network of DC connected, solar home systems as a way of extending the grid, or even mobile batteries walking around between electrified and unelectrified areas. And that's a whole kaleidoscope of mini grids, and it's all too often lumped into the same. So be specific both when planning and also when funding these projects. What is this for? And let's not try to make something what it isn't. Secondly, be inclusive. Mini grids really need to be accurate in their affordability analysis and making sure that the infrastructure that's being provided in an area is both of the type and purpose that consumers need in that area, but also that it's at a price that people are able to pay. I think in the early years of mini grids, and I don't know if this trend is over yet, I think it's still happening, people would overestimate both customer growth and demand growth in a way that undermined the models of operation of the project. So being inclusive means, don't design a grid that's only for the 5 wealthiest people in a community. You have to include everybody, both for purposes of access and just fairness, but also do that in a way that makes people have a reasonable shot at participating actively in the benefits of the project. Third, be transparent. That goes both for operational data. I don't think there's enough information sharing on operational data in the sector. It's kind of a closely guarded secret. Many people think it's proprietary, how their load grows or how their customers consume energy. I think we could do a lot more sharing there, but also being transparent between the people who design and build these systems and the people who live with their, the resulting energy. Finding ways both in terms of formal capacity building, like actual trainings and recurring trainings, refresh trainings, annually, quarterly, but also informally in terms of allowing, encouraging folks from the community, especially young people to observe mini grid operations in ways that are safe and responsible, not putting anybody at risk to electrical hazards, but including folks in this whole new world of being electrified and having responsibility for this infrastructure, and making it, people are going to learn much faster on electricity if they're included and the operations are transparent and people can understand what's going on. And then fourth, finally, the thing I've learned is don't ever assume the vendors are ready for this market. This is not a market that many vendors are focusing on. And in almost every project I've done, there's been, misconceptions of, what equipment needed to be supplied, what it needed to be capable of. And we're asking vendors to do things they've never done before. John mentioned earlier, PowerGen had to basically start a whole software development team just to make the meters talk to the inverters and the inverters talk to the, and we're finding that, the electric smart metering, the smart grid, the AMI, advanced metering infrastructure that's available, in the global north, is cost prohibitive to mini grids in the global south, which has created opportunities for new metering entrants to come in. But none of these small scale meters are providing the level of communications or operational transparency that would be expected by, for example, like a hospital or manufacturing facility. They're going to need to do more than like SMS the meter to see if they have a balance. They're going to need to have like a full customer dashboard, which very few of these metering companies provide. Demand side management, it's come up in the chat here, the Q&A and the comments. People talking about demand side management for mini grids. You could have way better LCOE because you could get away with smaller batteries if you could do demand side management and have some kind of dynamic control and interaction between different customers in the network. But very few of the meters allow for that. The meters that do allow for that, it's often a hard trip rather than an informed demand side management decision. And then the generation plants and the generation controllers, very few of them have demand side components because they're being designed for operating basically power plants and not for operating interactive utility systems. So John has told us that the way around that is to hire a software development team and build it themselves. But I do think that there's a lot more room for this kind of interactive control within the sector, and it's vendors who, quite honestly, don't have enough business in the sector to justify these type of bespoke interactions and interfaces. And so hopefully that will change with time.
So, okay, thank you. And you've gone, and as I'm looking to these questions, and I'm listening to all of you just say what you've said in the last few minutes, some of these questions have already been answered, I think, based on what you've responded, which is great because you're anticipating a lot. But what I'm going to do now, we have about 15 minutes, and and I've already sort of just scanned some of these questions that I think would be good for others to hear. And I'm going to leave it to our panelists here to jump in, and we can do the old-fashioned way with just put your hand up, but just see which one want to respond. I'm going to start with one that I think we've touched on, but I don't think we went too far in, which is how do we incentivize mini-grid developers to go to communities that they term not commercially viable? We talked about this, right? The current grant structure seems not to be working as all developers leave out the least viable ones who also need energy for productive use. Frank touched on that too. So how do we do this? I mean, it goes into the whole de-risking environment too. I don't know if this question is answerable, but does anybody want to take a stab at this?
I'll give it a shot, and other people can tell me what.
Yeah, we've got 15 minutes, so keep it as short as you can.
Right. I mean, the easy answer is to talk about electricity access as a right and not a privilege, right? At the moment, we don't have universal access. We're not on pace to meet SDG 7. And so electricity access is unfortunately a privilege. If it were to be a right, we would change the way that we fund these systems and make this last mile the priority. And it's easy to say, but in the US, after the Rural Electrification Act, from the 1930s to 1950s, we went from about 10% rural electrification to 90% rural electrification in 15 years. That would be great to do in Sub-Saharan Africa, but the way that it was done in the US was with 2% debt on a 30-year loan, and that's not being offered anywhere in Africa right now. So it's not that we don't know how to get to universal access, it's that the tools to get there haven't been offered in this context.
And Tombo, I just from your facial expression, you look like you had something to say about this, so go ahead.
I mean, I do have something to say, but I think it's most important to hear from the developers, right? Because they know exactly what's going to take them to those areas and make it work. So, I mean, I have my theories, but I'll throw it back to John and Archip and see, from the horse's mouth, what would take them to those areas. But I agree with what Frank said.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I also agree with what Frank said. I say that tariffs are always and everywhere a political question, right? So it cost me $100 to provide a certain amount of electricity, and you want me to serve customers that are only willing to pay $20 for that amount of electricity. There needs to be a credible tool that figures out where that $80 in between is going to come from, and that tool needs to not only have the capacity to provide that $80, need to be able to provide that $80 over the life of the project. As long as that tool exists, we're happy to serve customers at any and all levels. And that also noting that mini-grids are not the solution for all the electrification of the continent. They're still a solution for a significant chunk of the electrification gap, but there are communities that are not. There are communities in the US today that are off grid, right? So figuring out who the solution is best for, and who the solution is best for in a world where everybody has to pay what it costs to produce the energy, and then thinking about how to expand that group with reliable tools to bridge the gap for communities that are not able to pay what it costs to generate the energy is the answer.
And back to the title, you've got to make sure that keeping the lights on all the time, I think. Yes, Arship, go ahead.
Yes, I think in addition to what has been said, especially to make the tools available to fill the revenue gaps into areas where actually there's less demand and probably the client's ability to pay is very low. Is also to promote a public-private sector engagement, and this is something we have been seeing also in GSU, where we advocate for the government to provide more of their financing support, especially for the connectivities and also revenue losses, as a capex subsidy. The other way also to go around it is to go with the national planification strategy, where probably around those rural areas, probably there are industrial zones that's the government is projecting to deploy. Then you jointly develop projects with the government where the industries becomes the clients that de-risk your investment for the local rural community people. That guarantees a big offtake of your energy. They can be flexible to pay a higher rate than the rural community members. That's another way to deal with it, in addition to subsidy and productive use instrument.
So more partnerships, basically. Another question that I want to ask, and we've got about 10 minutes. Actually, we have about 8 minutes. To what extent are mini-grid developments being paired with other rural development efforts, either on other infrastructure projects like telecommunications, hospitals, schools? And I know NRECA International, we do sometimes partner, but I'd like to hear with in either John or Aisha, all of you. Should they be, or are they currently, the ones that you've been involved in, partnered with other development projects? Anyone? John?
Yeah, I think okay. I'll answer this from the power gen perspective.
Please.
Most of our projects are, standalone operations. We're not going in, partnered with any other type of large institution. We will welcome the partners that are interested in those things, because the whole point of providing electricity to these communities is to enable. There's no demand for electricity per se. There's a demand for the services that access to electricity provides, right? So we are in the business of enabling these partners, but I've found it can very quickly become hairy and difficult if you are trying to, in addition to implementing this very difficult business model, then layer on and coordinate with all these other entities to do something that addresses both access to electricity and health and education. I think the types of partnerships that I've found really productive and successful is where we say, okay, we're coming in and providing access to electricity to this community, and we welcome people who are interested in education to support this school that now has access to electricity, and support this healthcare facility with tools that can utilize that electricity, whether that's fridges and freezers for their vaccine storage, or new electrical diagnostic equipment that couldn't be put in the hospital before because it required electricity. That's the kind of thing. It's a more decentralized sort of collaboration.
Okay. And I see that Tombo's got a hand up. Go ahead, Tombo.
Yes, Zoraida, I wanted to add that I think, one of the things that we are seeing now is a more active acknowledgement by governments and development partners that, provision of energy is really the enabler to all economic development, right? So that being the case, there really is need to bundle a lot of health programs, agricultural programs, along with provision of electricity. And I think that, as increasingly this becomes accepted and recognized, we will tend to see governments, development partners coordinating a lot more access to electricity with these additional programs. And I think the end result of that will be, customers that can actually then afford that electricity. So we're going to have better customers because they have access to economic activity, because they have access to healthcare, because they have access to education. Therefore, they could probably afford, some of the tariffs that we were talking about before, where we were like, oh, what do we do with these communities that can't afford it? Well, maybe you can make them better customers by giving them, improved livelihoods. So I think we see that happening a lot more, especially now with health. There's a lot of programs that are looking at, healthcare electrification and, extending then, those mini grids to the surrounding areas to serve those communities. And I think, this just needs to become more systematic, more holistic, along with agriculture, along with education, to really tie everything together. Another good example of where we're seeing it is in Ethiopia. There's a dream project there where they're tying, irrigation with mini grids and then access to surrounding areas. So we're seeing it happen a lot more. And I think it really needs to be more holistic, more coordinated, so that, as John said, it can become hairy if he's now trying to coordinate all these different entities and programs. But, if government is central, if development partners are central, and John has to just come in and provide the power, then we have, a viable working model that recognizes energy as central to rural economic development.
All of you have a lot of work to do. I think I'll give an opportunity for one more person to respond to this, and unfortunately we do have to wrap up. Frank or Arship, would you like to respond to this question before we close up? About the bundling. I like that description.
Looks like Arship has his hand up.
I think he had his hand up from before, but I'll take anybody at this point.
No, I'll let Frank take.
Okay,
Frank, go ahead.
My closing thought would be that the topic of this webinar is keeping the lights on, and I think we have talked a lot about the capex side of it, which is how do we get access into these remote areas. We also have to talk about keeping the lights on, preserving the access in the areas that have it. And I think that means some more nuanced structures. We talked a lot about the vendor side and about the equipment, the operations, the remote monitoring, but also sustaining finance. If there's, a lot of the incentive structures are based on results-based financing, which helps with the initial investment, but doesn't really stay involved or stick around or keep supporting operations. And so incentivizing mini grids to include, equipment replacement in their long-term levelized cost of energy and not to understate the OpEx in order to be more attractive to near-term financing. And then once mini grids get into distress, or there's some kind of premature failure of equipment or some shortcoming in the mini grid operations, making sure we support those developers and those mini grids, making sure that people keep access in the long term and not leaving behind a failed development agenda of assets that no longer work because they're not being supported.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So we do have to wrap up, and I see that there were a bunch of questions and comments, which is great. My recommendation is to keep the conversation going. And I'd also like to remind everyone before we close out that this is, again, the first of the 3 webinars that we're having this series. The next one is going to be on October 25th, same time, not same place. You'll have to register it for it. And it's titled, It Takes a Community. So a different side of the story in how to keep a mini grid running. And we'll have another panel that will discuss why successfully operating mini grid involves buy-in and support from the community that it serves. So if you haven't registered, go ahead and do that at the same place where you registered for this one. We'll be setting up more information about that shortly. And last but not least, I think we all can agree that the panelists have been fantastic. So thank you for taking the time to share all your knowledge and experience with us. And of course, thank you USAID for making this possible, and also US Energy Association. And of course, thank you to all the attendees for being here today. And I hope to see, and I'll be moderating it again, and I hope to see everybody back here on the 25th of October. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.